Welcome to the True Knowledge Podcast Show with Atticus. True Knowledge is a podcast interviewing the most interesting experts in the world. Without further ado, here is your host.
Today's guest is Dr. Lecci. He's a professor of psychology at the University of North Carolina and the director of clinical services at Mars Memory Health Network. Welcome, Dr. Lecci.
Thank you, Atticus.
Continue our conversation.
Sure. Yeah, so I think the big challenge of the idea of access to a lot more information than we've ever had before and making it open access, not just to a PhD in an area, but how that can lead to stimulating thoughts. I think the big challenge we have now is finding a way to effectively eliminate the noise meaning misinformation, which seems to have really escalated the last few years that we've really seen.
Internet and social media.
Yeah, internet, social media, where information can be put out there that is false, but can spread just as quickly as information that is true, and then in the absence of some internal check. So what's fascinating about comparing, say, media, mass media, whether it's blogs or just any posts that gets tweets that get retweeted, is that information moves much, much faster than it does in science. Science is like a slow lumbering elephant, but it makes it less likely that we go way off track, right to error. So errors could occur in a step or two, but normally there's a course correct, and we always find, hey, this turns out this research was wrong, or maybe even in the rare cases someone fabricated data. That stuff comes out because when a finding comes out, the field doesn't take a hard right or a hard left. It begins to arc in one way, and then as other people are able to replicate it, it continues to arc. If they can't, it self-corrects and comes back to where it was. In social media, of course, boom, something goes out there, real or not, it spreads just as fast. And so therefore, as I said, there's a lot of sort of tangential movements, a lot of wasted movements. And so what we want to do is somehow harness the speed that we see on the side of mass media and social media, that we can get information advancing, but tempering it with the caution that comes with science, where you kind of want to see replicability, verifiability before we start spending too much time going down that track. When we can master putting those two together, I don't have a solution for it here, but when we can master those two together, then we'll become much more efficient. And then I think you'll see like these sort of quantum increases in information, knowledge, learning, advancements. It's amazing how advancements in one area can have these ripple effects in a number of areas. In fact, there's a study, so we do some research over on Directed Memory Center in town, so we're very concerned with things like Alzheimer's, etc. And one of the huge advances that really flew under the radar a few years back was that they were able to replicate some markers, upstream precursors of Alzheimer's in a petri dish. And so the implications for that is now all of a sudden, okay, if I can do that, that means that I can now test a number of compounds to, for example, treat Alzheimer's pathology much more quickly, because I don't have to go through all the FDA clearance, the time and cost to run major trials, if I could potentially test something in a petri dish. And as soon as I test that at least tells me, is there some promise to moving on? It doesn't guarantee that there'll be a change over there, but if it doesn't work in the petri dish, I can move that to the less likely. And so I can already prioritize hundreds of different compounds that would have taken me, 10 years to figure out if I had to go through the whole chain of, animal testing to human testing, etc., when I can immediately do it in a petri dish, see if anything happens. So those are those kind of changes that have like a seismic impact that can occur, again, somewhat independent of a study that's happening here. And you can think of other brain diseases, etc., where if you can replicate things in that way. So I think that what you're talking about is very exciting, this idea and how we can harness that and use it, as I said, in a way where we're being still efficient enough that we're not spending a bunch of time going down a wild goose chase. as we see right now, where we're having our struggles cleaning up misinformation in social media, etc.
I have this record over here.
Yep. Okay. Lots of recording.
Yeah.
But that, as we said, that's kind of more of a broader kind of thing rather than the specific topic you wanted to, or that we were going to discuss. But interesting.
Are you familiar with any nootropics?
I'm sorry.
Nootropics.
So, from a research standpoint, or
yeah, I know a lot of people take stuff that's for Alzheimer's.
Yes. So, let me make some general comments about that. There is a lot more noise, probably 100-fold noise to signal in that. And I, whenever I give talks on the topic, I would say 9 out of 10 questions are focused on that. And so, say, what about coconut oil? Is that going to make me vote?
Like,
just as one example. But
NMN.
Yes. So there are a number of both naturally occurring and synthesized products that are now targeting specifically to decrease the likelihood of developing things like Alzheimer's dementia.
Yes.
Efficacy at this point has not been demonstrated very effectively for any of those. In fact, the one thing I will say, though, so this would be a good plug if we're going to get information out there that is legitimate, there is actually some very nice research emerging since about 2015 in terms of controlled study, but preceding that in terms of more general studies that suggest that there are certain dietary shifts that can definitely decrease the likelihood of developing a dementia later in life. In fact, you can even Google a MIND diet, M-I-N-D, and it's a cross between a diet to lower hypertension, the standard diet to lower hypertension, and a Mediterranean diet. And it's actually been studied essentially triggered as a diet to address neurodegenerative diseases, and an acronym for it is MIND. And it basically involves, well, as you might imagine, so low sodium intake, obviously, but Mediterranean diet, so you're looking at a lot of vegetables and fruits, fish, fruits in particular, those high in antioxidant contents, some foods that have anti-inflammatory properties to them. And a couple of controlled studies have demonstrated some really powerful effects of this MIND diet, even within about a 3 to 4 year period, showing a decrease in the likelihood of converting to dementia, the Alzheimer's type. In fact, the effect sizes for the MIND diet are larger than any pharmacological effects that have been documented for the medications that have been FDA approved for treatment of Alzheimer's. So I would say if we're actually thinking about something that's really got some data behind it to support it, that would be the first place, and it encompasses a number of sort of natural approaches to addressing that disease, and that would be probably the safest place to start. The other thing too is that's dietary stuff that's not synthesized, healthy foods. It's actually a pretty good diet too, so it's nothing that you'll find too unappealing. If you ever travel in the Mediterranean region, you're going to eat pretty well, so it's not rice cakes and water. And so in that regard, it's even if someone says, well, ultimately it didn't have that benefit, you'll still be eating well and benefiting in other ways. But the data so far look very promising in terms of having some effects, and also I should say having effects because they compared the MIND diet also to the diet to lower hypertension and the Mediterranean diet separately. And while those each had some effects, the effects they had were very dependent upon being strictly following the diet. They had smaller effects, but if you didn't follow the diet strictly, you didn't get the effect. The interesting thing about the MIND diet is it had a substantially larger effect, but it still had an effect even when you followed it just moderately. So in other words, not following it fully. And this creates a phenomenon known almost like a dose-response curve, which is always nice to see. When you see a dose-response curve, it gives you even more certainty, even though you'd love to have everybody doing it fully. The truth is, when you have, as occurs with diets, not everybody is able to do it fully for a variety of reasons, but when you see an effect that follows that curve, the more you followed it, the more of the effect you got in terms of staving off onset of dementia. That actually is an even stronger finding for that drug, because it has both the effect compared to the other conditions and within the condition by how much you followed it. And what it also tells you is someone who's not quite as diligent following it, this will still work. You'll still getting almost a little over half of the effect was still there, even if you were moderately following the diet. So it's especially given how most people struggle to stay to a diet perfectly, I think that's a really powerful finding for if you were going to do anything tomorrow to say, how can I make a difference? And by the way, they did this on older individuals, which is also a big deal, because if I was to do an intervention on you and show an effect, that's still important, but obviously that might suggest you need like 30 years of this to have an effect. But if I'm starting to test people who are in their 70s and showing an effect, that's telling you, even when you're, the ship's coming into port, a couple of those degrees is making a major effect. So in other words, it's not too late, even if you're 65, 70, 75, this would be something to consider, strongly consider. And I'd consider this a prophylactic treatment. You don't have to wait until you got a MCI diagnosis to do this. This is something that would make sense to do.
You seem very passionate about this diet.
Yeah, well, I'm always excited when, coming back to the original theme we talked about, when you have a chance to get some information to the public that they might not otherwise know. I give tons of talks, but in a room there's 100 people, and of course, there are billions of people on the planet, so you think, okay, here are 100 people that now have this message, and they may chat with a few others, but the limited ripple effects that occur are limited. It's a good thing about a podcast is sometimes you can
24/7 is always going to be on.
Right. So so that is so I'm excited about always the opportunity for people to hear about things that they're otherwise in their daily lives they're busy.
They don't have access to.
Yeah, they don't have access, and how much time are they going to spend on all the different things?
No one's going to take a course, don't have time for that stuff.
That's right.
Yeah. That's one thing, I study economics, and I just love how right now it's a really hot topic, but no one, I feel like whenever I get into certain debates online or so, it's very surface level. You can never go deep because people don't have a fundamental understanding, so it just becomes you educating about the fundamentals to them before you can take the conversation to the next level. Right. You go off track. So earlier you mentioned about how there's a lot of false data and things like that, and then how science would take a step back and retrack it. Are there any really big major changes in the psychology field that got refuted? Or?
I think in the last 4 or 5 years, one of the big issues that psychology and other sciences are dealing with is something that's broadly known as the replication crisis.
Yes.
So if you're even a passive reader of the scientific literature knows that one of the things that's coming up is some rather famous findings have not replicated really well in a number of fields. So I'll focus on psychology, but of course it's happening in a number of fields. And so part of this has led to kind of a gut check of, okay, so are we doing science the way we need to be doing it, and how can we address this problem? And I really have to give kudos to the field for a number of things that folks have attempted to do. And I'm not, even the ones that I don't think were necessarily the problem, so like some people are doing like pre-registered data sets, where like you would say, you tell the journal, I'm doing this, I'm going to replicate this study, and they basically guarantee you a publication regardless of what you'll find. And that tries to address the issue of the publication bias, meaning 1,000 researchers study topic A, only one gets a significant finding, they publish it, we don't see the other 999 that were negative, that maybe we're looking at the same thing, and so that one might be a chance finding, and so if we have, pre-registrations put less of an emphasis on findings and more design.
Publish the positive findings and negative findings.
Right. It also tries to address issues like fraud, because you're kind of putting it out there to begin with, which is what we require now. Drug companies have to do. They didn't have to do this a long time ago, or not so long ago anyways, and that led to some very selective reporting of stuff, because there's billions of dollars riding on it. Companies could be out of business or hit it big if this happens, so FDA forces them to pre-register sites and such, so it does address a little bit of the potential for fraud. But I don't know if either fraud or the positive publication bias are necessarily our biggest issues. I think, in my humble opinion, I think one of the bigger issues we have that it can be addressed in the replication crisis is the lack of development of good models, models that can be tested, empirically tested. And I think when you get a lot of one-off studies, you increase the likelihood of having these spurious findings that might not be what the authors think they are. And I think the more we move towards kind of big models, so big data is good, but it has to come also with big models, theoretical models that fit it. Because when you have a good theoretical model that sets up some very clear questions and very, very clear experiments, then you're less likely to see this kind of teetering that can occur. And I think the field has done a good job with that. And there's there's a few journals now that do like big questions that we want answered, and they'll invite authors on either side of a debate, for example, to design studies, collaborate and design studies that attempt to resolve differences that currently exist. I think that's a great way to move the field forward, because now you bring frenemies, so to speak, together. These are researchers who have very different ideas about what's going on, and they've each conducted their own studies to suggest this. And so now they go, okay, let's bring them together and say, now design a study that really will kind of more definitively say, is it A or B, or under what conditions is it A and under what conditions is B, which often ends up being the case. And it allows them to kind of take some individuals who have these very different perspectives and sort of look from the other person's perspective and say, what would convince you of their data being accurate, and vice versa? What study would that be? Why don't you two design that study together, and then we'll run it. We'll run it at both places. And,
well, it's fascinating.
So I think that's kind of both the crisis and I think the good thing that has come out of that crisis. We'll also say the replication crisis can also tend to be overblown in the sense that, there are some areas we clearly had some replication issues. There's other areas where we haven't. In fact, I was just at a conference in D.C. and attending a talk on Big Five personality traits and such, and a paper's coming out sometime in the next couple of months that's basically showing those effects replicated very well. This is a massive study attempting to replicate all the Big Five findings, and they replicate 92% of the effects and the same effect sizes. That's another issue, because a lot of times when people replicate, they find the effect, it's a lot smaller than the original study, and they're basically showing the effects are the same. So there's some pockets of research in psychology that are replicating fine. Of course, that's not making the news,
right?
But
in every field, when they start finding out these errors,
that comes through, which is a good thing. I mean, that's the good thing about science, which is it's got an internal check. That's why we have more confidence in that than, say, Twitter or something else. There is an internal check here, because
credibility.
Yeah, you publish something, but as soon as you put it out there, someone else is going to look at it and say, interesting, let me take a look and try and do that. And if I don't replicate it, then that starts the reverberations. If I do, you see that field grow and expand. So it's a great, and even, truthfully, even publishing. I mean, when you go to publish and submit something, you're being reviewed by other scientists who are competing for space in the exact same journal. So they have a vested interest in being hypercritical of what you do, because when they give your study the go, that's one less spot in that journal that they publish in that's available for their work. So it's a very kind of competitive. In fact, I would say it's a hypercritical. There's probably more things that don't get published that should get published. But that's kind of the conservative bias you see in science, and so hence the lumbering elephant kind of
but it filters out a lot.
It filters out a lot at the front end, maybe a little too much, but I think from that standpoint, that's one example of why the downside is it's slow moving. The upside is you can usually pretty sure about some of the things that are coming out that they've been tested by a lot of folks, and folks who are quite critical of it too.
So it might be good to actually have some enemies that double checks your
intellectual enemies.
Enemies,
and they're there. I mean, because you have your ideas of how something works, and for every person who has an idea of something works, there's at least one other person who has a different idea about how that works. Typically, many others.
I want to get your thoughts on something.
Yeah.
Competition. I'm actually going to do a podcast with Dr. King. He's a political science professor. And this very ties into with the current trade war and such, like for me as an econ major. So it seems like there's adequate enough, like a tipping point, right, of when you have too much competition, right, then maybe not enough research get published out, maybe people start trying to destroy each other's research and things like that. When you have too little competition, nothing new is really created. Right? And I see this effect in politics, right? Like if you're a candidate running, you don't want a bunch of people running against you. Right. But then it seems interesting. It's like the 2016 elections, like maybe Trump would not have won if there weren't so many Republicans running against him.
Right. That's probably true, where you kind of get to hear more depth versus something has to work effectively,
Right.
stand out in a crowd,
Yeah.
is not necessarily depth, because you need a one-liner. He's very good at one-liners,
He's very good at
right?
one-liner.
There may not be much behind the one-liners, and
Yeah.
therefore...
Or maybe
so-
you let your enemy kill themselves off, and
Yeah,
then
that's right.
you
Yeah.
strategically comes out at the end. But
Right.
if it were just you against someone else, you
Right.
would just lose out initially.
Right.
This competition is really fascinating.
Yeah, what is the optimal level? And I think, so I won't comment so much on the economy or even politics of it, because obviously that's not my
Yeah, I
area
want to
of
understand the psychology
expertise.
aspect.
But the psychology end of it, I think where you do have to find that good middle ground is part of it you've already alluded to, which is kind of what motivates individuals. So the absence of competition doesn't. Too much of it could be overwhelming and not necessarily lead the best to emerge. But I think there's also another element to it too. So while I talked about science from a competitive standpoint, I think the very best scientists we have also understand it's a collaborative effort. So I may be very vested in doing this, but if I can't step back and see, look, I'm one cog in a giant wheel, no more or less important than these other ones, and at some level, if I don't get that collaborative sense, and so if you then want to turn this around to economic trade or anything else.
Yeah.
So, okay, it's very natural for human beings to want to put themselves in a position to gain the most, lose the least, most advantageous. But if at some point you don't also have some collegial sense of, look, I'm not trying to crush everyone. I'm trying to get something, but if the cost is too great on someone else, maybe that's too much for me. And if you don't have that view, then that's not helpful, because in the end, if completely crushing other folks, well, then that leads to, other kinds of downstream consequences. You now create a ton of enemies, and people want you to fail, and versus
long-term effects.
Yeah, there are long-term effects. So whatever you think you may have gained in the short run, hey, I got an extra 1% here, but now you got a bunch of partners who maybe aren't so partner with you anymore, and they'll look to take advantage of you down the road. That 1% will have been a very expensive 1% gain now and a massive cost down the road. And they go, well, you know what? You put us over the barrel for this. We'll let you deal with that one on your own. And so I think those are the downstream. And if we don't recognize that, that's your downfall. That's ultimately, that's what brings Rome falling is, you get some...
History always repeats.
History does repeat itself.
Human
Conquering is not a great thing. You may feel like it's good at the time because you're winning, but or at least on the surface winning. So I think the psychology is to recognize that, hey, look, we're all human beings. We're all here. There's some lines on the ground that separate us from Canada and from wherever else. But in the end, okay, our country, that's fine. We have to. I'm not saying that we. But we have to be altruistic. We have to recognize we're all in this.
But it seems like there's a tipping point, right? Like when the altruistic gets taken advantage of, and then people become very tribalism.
Right, that's right.
And stuff. Unless I see this shift and stuff.
So altruism, self-protection.
Yeah.
I think all of those things. I mean, you can. They're in a very delicate balance, and if you get rid of them, then you extinguish altruistic behavior. You extinguish, right? And at the same time, if you're overly altruistic, there can be some consequence there as well. So it's we can't eliminate them. We have to keep a balance of those things and to recognize, okay, we've got our share, for example, on this. Let's kind of move this, just like any successful business. If it can only go so well if all the money is pouring to one person who's draining it and working people to death, etc. That company's going to collapse. If they start reinvesting in their workers and those sorts of things, then those companies tend to thrive. They're happy. People don't want to leave there. They want the company to succeed because they're part of it. And so those companies have the longevity, even though profits might be a little lower for a few years. You track them after 20, 30 years, that will be a much healthier company and more likely to still exist in that format than the other one that is raping.
It seems like it's part of the human condition. It's balances, right? Like I keep thinking about all the problems that we have being faced by people before us. It's philosophers have written about these. And the social problems, nothing new.
We can learn a lot from our history for sure. I mean, these aren't new problems, right? And that goes actually, ironically, back to your very first question, which is, we send these people to get all this education, all this learning. Well, at some point, and in fact, even the point you made just a moment ago where you have these conversations, they seem so superficial and you have to spend all this time doing instruction, is, that's exactly why we want as many people as possible to have all the basic information on whatever topic of relevance, as many as possible, hence the value of education, right? And like, why would we spend all this money to educate a populace? Because it helps for everybody to be on page 25 instead of page 1.
I'm very big on the idea that the Russian attacks, right? Very, very smart about how to destroy democracy. The base of democracy is,
absolutely.
If you have a bunch of uneducated voters, that's where you hit the hardest.
Convince them misinformation,
overflow the information, even for intellects.
And our country is sufficiently moderate in the sense that overall things are, even when they tilt in quotes heavily one way or the other, we're still just looking at the difference of a few 100,000 votes that ultimately swing things one way or the other. Even landslide elections, they're really, when you look at the numbers, not landslides. A place or two they might be, but overall. So what that tells you is it doesn't take a lot to tip scales in one direction or the other. A few 100,000 people.
All these different disciplines. I like talking to Dr. Bollinger about how there's different ways of persuasion. And essentially, he's in communication, so as a business major, he's in the business of persuasion. Right. And nowadays, you have all these marketing people coming out, these gurus, these fake gurus. Everybody's life coach now. Everybody's something.
That must be one of the more popular jobs these days as a life coach. You do see a lot of
everybody's a life coach. Right. I'm really interested to see how the next recession is going to hit, and these people is really going to washed out. So the true deal is going to survive, and all these people have to get real jobs. Right.
It'll be interesting. Those are always when things are going well, successful plans and unsuccessful plans can look very similar. But obviously, as times get tough, then some are a little more resistant to those things than the flash in the pans struggle. So this isn't probably our best time to test our mettle, so to speak. What's really working.
I want to talk about deception. The psychology of it, right? Because or manipulation or influence and stuff like that. Are there any ways to combat against misinformation from a psychologist's perspective?
First thing that comes to mind is not necessarily unique to psychology, but our interest in, are we actually interested in truth versus are we interested in forwarding an agenda or a point that we have? That's a tough human thing because we all usually have some idea and that's what we want to forward. Because if you really want to test your ideas, you don't just share with people who share your opinions, right? You kind of go into the lion's den and you want to hear what dissenting views are. There's research in psychology that dates back to the 70s on groupthink, which is basically some of the poorest, mostly political decisions that we've made in our country were when people surrounded themselves with folks who were very like-minded. There weren't any dissenting opinions. There was usually a sort of autocratic leader of the group that would kind of say, well, we're all in agreement, right? Like lots of kind of consensus building. And that often leads to poor decisions because you're not considering any other perspectives. And so there's, in that research that occurred based on some of that groupthink phenomena, there are some recommendations on things to do. So when you're in groups making decisions, you always want to have at least one strong-willed dissenting voice who doesn't drink the soup, who doesn't believe what you believe, so that so you have kind of a critical, much like we were talking about with those reviewers for journals and all that. Right. That's why you do that, is you have to have someone say, I'm not buying this and here's why. And then if you have a good counter argument to that, that's then a better idea.
And that's how ideas progress.
That's how they progress, right?
And eventually the winner stands out.
Right.
And this actually ties into the big five, which I really want to talk about. Agreeableness right there.
Right. Big five. So obviously agreeableness is one of the things that is highlighted for people getting along well, which from a social standpoint is, of course, highly desired and favorable. But I think what I would suggest is when I say that there's a dissenting voice, again, to kind of take us out of the context of the last few years, I don't think dissension has to be seen as conflict. So I can have a different view. I mean, let's take our political system because I'm making allusions to that right now. I can have very different political views than you. Doesn't mean I have to hate you. Because in the end, I have to understand your views, regardless of how liberal or conservative, wherever you are on the spectrum. in the end, you think that's the solution to the problem, and I, on whatever other end of that spectrum, might believe, well, I think this is the solution to the problem. And so then the question becomes, so why do we have such different views?
What happened?
To both to get us there, and then what information are we using to come to our conclusions? And is there something testable and discussable there, or are they just complete ideological differences? Where if you just have ideological differences, those are harder to reconcile. If you have differences of opinions of how to solve a common problem, those can be reconciled. And I think if you're, and I'll stick to the political example, so if you're on either side of the aisle and you think the other side has nothing to offer you, you're hugely mistaken. Because, there's a tension between, well, again, we'll use conservative and more liberal. It's the exact same point we start off with, talking about science and the kind of release of data, right? So that wild release of data leads you to incredible new ideas, and not necessarily thinking you have to always do things the way you prefer, but it leads you potentially to make a lot of mistakes because you're trying unvetted things. The conservative model might say, okay, we're just going to keep on cranking what we've always done before, but then recognize, hey, times are changing. There's a lot of new ways we could go. And so the successful is something in the middle that has that tension of let's not stray too far from what we know works to be too costly if we screw up, but let's not just sit on what we know. We have to push ourselves a little bit to, just because it was good for 1950s doesn't mean it's good for 2000.
It seems like it's a theme, right? Like even with the AI.
That's right.
And things
That's
like
right.
that. It's, a human and AI is going to beat a human by itself or AI by itself. It's fascinating.
Right. But we need good data for the AI to build itself. If it's built on poor data, it'll be a poor AI model and send us in the wrong direction. So I think that tension reoccurs both in our conversation, but it's replicated in every field over time. That's kind of the age-old phenomenon, is kind of finding that sweet spot.
Can we talk more about the Big Five? Sure. I want to know, how should someone look at it from someone that doesn't have the expertise? Because there's a lot of misconception about these personality tests, like Myers-Briggs and all these.
Right.
Yeah.
So yes, there are a lot of personality tests that are not very well founded in science. You mentioned one of them, the Myers-Briggs, kind of built on Jungian philosophy, Carl Jung's theories. So the Big Five was a little different attempt. It sort of, the first forays into the Big Five really emerged in about the 60s and 70s. And they really emerged from an analysis of language. So the thinking for the Big Five is fundamentally that we are trying to identify the reoccurring big common traits we use to describe people. And so where the Big Five initially emerged was actually through an analysis of language. So they analyzed, it was first done in the English language. They identified all of the adjectives that describe human behavior. I think there were about 18,000-ish. And then they analyzed those adjectives, so analyzing at the item level, if you will, to look at how things, for lack of the statistical terminology, hang together. It was through factor analysis. But the bottom line is, when you tend to see one adjectives, what other adjectives co-occur with those adjectives. And that allows you to essentially group the adjectives. And then these groupings, form of data reduction, basically can come down to what we call the Big Five factors that, so neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness to new experience, which is basically creativity, and conscientiousness. Those are the Big Five. And then you can essentially get from all of those adjectives up to the Big Five. And now this has been replicated in different cultures, different languages, and showing that...
Can we go more in details about each one of them?
Sure. So...
And it never seems like either side is right or wrong about it. So but there are certain difficulties people will face if they're too far on the spectrum.
Right. So then after kind of identifying what these Big Five are, of course, then you start developing measures to assess them. You start identifying what are these Big Five factors linked to, what important outcomes. One debate in the field is, are they just descriptive labels, or is there something more to them in terms of linking them to like underlying physiology, biological functioning? So just as an example, I'll talk about two of the more heavily investigated big five. In fact, they're often referred to as the big two. So you got the big five, and then sometimes talk about the big two, and those are neuroticism and extroversion. And the reason they're talked about quite a bit is those two are, first of all five are considered independent of each other. So when you think neuroticism and extroversion, you can almost plot them on a perpendicular to each other. So they're considered, that's mathematically orthogonal, independent of each other. And so regardless of where you are on introversion, extroversion spectrum, that doesn't necessarily mean you are on a particular part of the neuroticism.
I see.
Neuroticism, and the other end of the spectrum would be emotional.
There's no correlation whatsoever.
You have very low correlation between the two. So if you're neurotic, it means you're emotionally unstable, and the other side is emotionally stable. Extroverted, the other end is introversion.
I'm reading this book right now called The Defining Decade, about how 30 is now your new 20, and she talks about how neuroticism is actually one of the biggest predictors for a difficult partner.
Yes. So one area of research that's been very heavily investigated for neuroticism is how it links to mental health, physical health. The higher neuroticism, generally, the poorer your mental health. The long-term consequence of mental health, long-term consequence of physical health, long-term consequences on relationships. And so many of the things that have been investigated, even mortality actually has been linked to. So the more neurotic individuals are.
And more impulsive.
Right. So neuroticism can link to a lot of different traits. In certainly some of the theoretical models, impulsivity is on there.
Can we go back a little bit more? I want to understand, where do the big five come from? As in, like, do you believe it's more biological, or it's more environmental?
So they vary. They're not all equal in that regard.
Okay.
So, for example, the big two are thought to have very strong biological. So the neuroticism is linked to functioning in the limbic system.
Okay.
Extroversion is linked to the ascending reticular activating system, ARAS for short. And that's been studied since like the 60s and 70s. Hans Eysenck did a lot of that early work. And the thinking is those have strong biological connections. It also means there's a stronger heritability, meaning like a genetic component that you would have inherited from your parents. But then you look at another big five factor like openness to new experience, creativity.
Right.
That's thought to have a very low genetic contribution. It's thought to be much more environmentally based. It's also not seen as one of those traits that has quite the same type of marker outcomes. Like it's not predicting things like your mortality. It's not predicting. So it predicts other things like what you tend to do and enjoy, but it doesn't necessarily predict how long you're going to live. Neuroticism does. So what
does neuroticism say about what?
So the higher you are on neuroticism, the more likely that you are at some point in your life to suffer from some type of mental illness, most typically anxiety and or depression. It also means you're more likely to have physical health problems, everything from cardiovascular disease to strokes. You're more likely to die at a younger age, and that effect, as you kind of move from the extreme end of neuroticism one end to the other, can be 5 to 6 years. Like it's a pretty substantial. It's not a few days, so it's a pretty substantial effect on life expectancy. And you can see how these things are linked, right? Obviously, as you have more mental health and physical health problems, well, that obviously in turn affects your longevity. But there's research even to suggest that even if you covary out physical health, there's still an effect for neuroticism.
So these are like generation trauma that gets passed down.
In a sense, it's almost like that, right? So if you think of an experience that you have now, don't mistake neuroticism as a trait to the transient experiences you can have from a trauma. So it doesn't necessarily automatically. So there are many people who have been exposed to very traumatic events, but they're not neurotic. In other words,
So the big five is pretty permanent throughout your life.
Correct. They're personality factors, so they're considered to be stable. They're considered to be longevity. And
are there any research on if certain like catastrophic events happen to you?
So,
because I know about attachment types and things like that.
The data suggests that the personality factors are pretty resistant to a number of events over the course of your life. But that doesn't mean that they don't change, but it means that they're less dependent on the specific events that occur. Having said that, we do know that physiological changes, for example, occur in individuals. So for males, if they're really high on, like you mentioned, impulsivity, which the only reason I didn't get a lot into impulsivity is some models put impulsivity under extroversion, and some models put impulsivity under neuroticism. So it's one of those, when you draw the plane of it sits kind of in the middle between introversion, between neuroticism and extroversion. But there's a lot of data to suggest that extroversion is also, impulsivity is one of those things that kind of burns out over life. So people who are very impulsive, males, for example, have highest impulsivity during, their adolescence, which makes them high driving risks, all these kinds of things.
Right.
But then you find those same individuals when they're 50 and their impulsivity has dropped a lot over time. Now, if they were high impulsive at 18, they'll still be above average at 50, but at 50, you're a lot lower in impulsivity than you were at 17, 18. And so these things do change over time. And so we do see changes, but they're not necessarily dependent on, you had this trauma happen. They're just some natural changes that seem to occur over the span of lifespan that result in some differences in how these factors and traits manifest.
I kind of want to talk about, so I feel like we're in this postmodernism era, right? So essentially, everybody is an expert, and we don't really trust these expert knowledge on things. And I'm just, the whole idea, I'm like really trying to find real experts, right? And I'm trying to find a way that I think, so right now we're in the attention economy. I keep telling people that, right? So if you're a company, you can attract the most attention and retention rates and stuff. You're going to gain the most amount of money. I think what's going to happen after is going to be the trust economy.
Right.
I think it's going to be a trust economy.
Yep.
I think people start realizing that a lot of these fake money or fake gurus and other things are happening, and people start filtering out. But then I'm just really interested in, like, where do you think, I'm still trying to like get more expert knowledge on where do you think where it's gonna head it to you? Because essentially, like, I feel like a lot of technology, but also like marketing really just eroded trust from people to people and things like that.
So, how do you get truth out there versus how do you get a message out there which may or may not be accurate?
Like, if we don't trust a lot of people, then we might start forming tribes, or we should look up a certain leader that we think they will filter the knowledge out for us. But then
they don't, right? And if they
don't, if they're miscorrected, then all these followers are just misguided.
I mean, that's a fascinating question. I think, as I said, going back to what we discussed with regards to sort of science, the evolution of science, if you will, it's the trust is in the process, not in the people. And so the process of how science is done leads you to have confidence in the ultimate long-term replicated outcomes that we seem to find. That you don't want to put too much trust in one person who can always be fallible, intentional or not.
Yeah.
That they can have a bias, a mistake. Well, we all have biases, but some type of mistake that they made, and sometimes intentional misdirection. And so, but if you trust in the process is working, then look, in the long run, those things there may be some false stuff, but time will tell. It'll kind of let it come out. And
but it seems the problem is that nobody wants, take an hour or two of their life to sit down and learn the process and read the fundamentals and understand it. Yeah,
actually, one of the things we do in our field, so as much as people will take a topic when teaching in psychology, and they'll be really interested in a topic, but really what we're trying to teach, the underlying thing, and then it's in every single course, is how do we know what we know? And the more you can convey that to them, then they become lifelong learners, right? And it's sort of like, okay, now you have the recipe for how we know what we know. So the next time you see something, you can actually say, well, how do they know that? Not just, interesting fact, let me move on. But if it is something you want to get into, okay, here's how you can evaluate, is that a trustworthy phenomenon? Now, part of that's done in our field because, we have journals that have set up systems to make them more credible, the review process we discussed. And so when things come out of there, you can at least have a certain amount of acceptance of some credibility because they had to go through this gauntlet to come through. Twitter, of course, doesn't have that. Facebook doesn't have that. And so if something's posted, it wasn't vetted. It wasn't anything of that nature.
Nobody's held accountable for the action.
No one's account, right? A blog or something of that nature. Yeah. Then you got to trust the person, and that's moving away from the process. So, that idea of how do we kind of infuse that? I think that's part of the philosophy of a broad education for a lot of individuals to try and give them those skill sets, those critical thinking skills, exactly. And that helps us because if in the end, when too many people don't have those skills, then they can't vet at the decisions they need to make. When we go into an election, as much as we think your vote or my vote doesn't matter, the truth is cumulatively they really do matter. And if we can't discern what's good and what's correct, what's true and what's not, then we might as well flip a coin. I mean, so that's the critical thing about making sure enough people have the information to be able to filter properly, and it's hard to do that.
It's time consuming.
It's time consuming. There's a lot of agendas out there that
different incentives.
Yep, trying to misdirect folks intentionally. And
also, I mean, Netflix is so great. You can spend an hour. You can spend an hour reading about different candidates' political stands, where you can turn on something that's
entertaining against
made to retain your attention.
Right. So how to and that'll be. I think that's a challenge that I know I'm facing. When you contact me for an interview, and I said jokingly, well, you might want to talk to some younger folks. I think that's really our challenge in academia now. Is the more we get students coming in who've really come up in generations where information is dispensed very quickly in a dazzling kind of way. Mm-hmm. How do you convey information to them that keeps them engaged, that allows them to learn that?
How do you hack their attention for good?
Yeah, right. How do you have it's a good way of terming that, and that's a perpetual challenge. And of course, as we get older, it's harder to give examples that relate. As hard as we work to find those examples, they come naturally if you're the same generation or one generation off. But
I think the pendulum is going to swing the other way. I think people like these clickbaits and how so my phone's in black and white in grayscale. It's actually because I don't want to use color psychology to hack my brain to get me attention. I like red and these color, but also the articles about how Snapchat is actually the most insidious app ever made. It simulates slot machines by pulling it down and things like that. But I think at one point people's gonna stop believing and would just get ignored of these clickbaits on like BuzzFeed and things like that. That's very interesting read, but then you read it as not really such substance that changes your life. Right. Or these I see a lot of these 5-minute cooking videos and stuff like that, and it's almost like instant satisfaction. You don't really cook anything, right? You probably the process took like 2 hours, but they cook it right in front of you. Right. It's entertaining to watch.
That's true.
So I wonder what's next. I wonder what's going to swing back to. I wonder if it's going to go back to very minimalistic, right? People just want something that's known, proven. It's going to work every time you're going to use it, and they don't want such like clickbait and like interesting graph because they feel like, okay, that must be false.
Right. So does credibility? Does the more easily something gets my attention also then begin to raise my specter of doubt about its legitimacy? And sort of like the difference between, I guess, in public consumption, an ad and a news article, right? An ad will look glossy and the news article is. And ironically, people at one point started making ads that looked like news articles to make them look more legitimate.
Right. And swing back and forth.
Right. So it is.
Because we're always going to have new generation of people coming up with not that defensive mechanism, right? Or that filtering perception that we have developed over time.
Right. Absolutely.
So I guess we're always stuck in the cycle. We're trapped in this.
Yeah, I think the cycle is inevitable. I think the specific examples change, but the cycle is probably inevitable. And as I said, that's not necessarily a bad thing because I think, again, if you're static, you're sitting in one spot. I think you always have to be movement, has to be occurring. Right. Ideally, you're not moving too far, but the consequence of going far in one direction is usually there's a counter swing that'll come back. And so
closer to the truth, middle ground,
right? Or at least for some part of that swing until we get into the other side, because there's falsehoods everywhere, and so trying to find that middle ground where there's some replicability, there's some credibility coming from multiple sources of information. If you're talking about news, that's always one of the things that still separates a credible news network from, let's say, so am I confirming this? Is it coming from multiple sources versus maybe relying on one, maybe not credible source or something of that nature that you would, and do you have self-checking? That's always one of the things that I like to see is, as much as sometimes people draw attention to errors that someone makes, like you'll see, they reported this, and then they come back and say, this was actually incorrect, and blah, blah, blah. Well,
that builds trust.
That actually, I think that's a good sign. Yeah. When you see that happen, that tells me someone's checking. Yeah. That tells me, and they're holding that accountable, and they're coming back and saying, we thought this was correct, but in fact, we got some other information now that contradicts that, and so they correct a piece. So the process of correction doesn't, in my mind, doesn't mean that the system's busted. That's the part that tells me it's working.
Authentic.
Yeah.
And that's how it's going to win.
Right. So you do want to see that. And the same thing with science. We see erratums occurring all the time. Paper will come out and they'll say, well, actually, this needs to be corrected. Someone caught it, and they're trying to correct it. So, yeah.
Let's talk back on the big five. I'm so fascinated.
Okay.
So why a lot of psychologists didn't like the Myers-Briggs?
So the Myers-Briggs,
I don't know much about it.
Yeah, it's one of the most heavily used inventories outside the field of psychology, and it's really interesting questions. You're a good interviewer.
I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I do have to run.